Imagine a situation where there are two men. One is a father, and the other one is maybe the ex-husband of the wife. They're all having a dinner at the house, and the two families are celebrating something, and they're all getting along, and everything is wonderful. And there is an incident where one of the kids talks back to the dad and says something disrespectful to the father. The father loses it and has shouts at him, and everybody gets uncomfortable. Maybe the kid gets hit, slapped or something, and there's a big scene, and it just ruins the whole evening. Um, and so then the two parents or the adults are left at this dinner gathering, um, arguing, arguing about, the husband blames the wife, and the ex-husband of the wife who's there kind of is, he's also a friend, and so he's getting involved, and there's a moment of, where people start saying things that are heavy and personal, and maybe the ex-husband who's in this of the wife, who considers the father of the kid a friend, feels that he needs to say something that is true, and says, well, if you weren't so cold to your son and you paid some more attention to him, he wouldn't talk back to you that way. And the father gets so indignant, and it hits him so unexpectedly that he punches the other man, the friend or the ex-husband of the wife, in a fight, and they start fighting physically. So they take it outside, they go outside, and the neighbors see these two men fighting, and then they separate them, and you hear the friend of the father who made the comment, who felt he had to say his truth to the father of the kid, because he's the one that got hit, and that's where it all kind of escalated, blew up when the father's, punched his friend, the wife's ex-husband. He is the first one to cry out, he attacked me, he hit me. And so all of the public, all the people that gathered outside, start immediately siding with the who they start seeing as the victim, and they start seeing the father as the bad guy. But what they didn't see is what happened inside the house, that the ex-husband of the wife said something real harsh and emotionally violent, although it wasn't physically violent. This example, war is a human occurrence. War is not the confrontation, and it should not be the confrontation of systems of administration or or political rules that we have agreed to in the world. And so when one breaks a certain rule, then that is the one who's at fault. No, war, as well as human fighting, is a human affair. It's a human occurrence. It's understood through how we treat each other as human beings. And nations are the the constructions, the homes, the artifacts of human beings. They don't have a consciousness, they don't have emotional value, they don't have you can't attach the understanding of a war to the rules that we have established as international laws. You have to understand what happens between countries in the human capacity, because human beings are the ones who run countries. So what I'm trying to say is that if you're a good historian or if you're a sincere politician, you will talk about an international conflict in its human capacity, and that means the historical development of events that affected people's actions and reactions, or the actions and reactions of leaders. You will not try to turn it into something that has to do with a particular action as it refers to breaking an agreement or a rule or um, some kind of how can I say this? Administrative containment of definition of what is a nation and what are sovereign principles, for example, that are established in international law or in treaties. You will understand the human dynamics of that conflict. Historians do it when real good historians who are honest will describe, for example, the Second World War as the social dynamics that were happening in Europe that led to things later happening, that some of which have become sort of the iconic events that maybe led to um, the start of World War II, for example. Um, Wars and fights and human fights should not be understood through the louder, um, self-absolving victimization of that who was able to react more strongly emotionally because he was the one that was at some point hit, or because he knows that everybody has much more volatile intolerance towards physical violence. The people outside the house of this dinner gathering missed that moment in which very subtly and in a quiet, calm manner up to that point, the father, the friend of the husband said, well, you're selfish. You treat your kids like dirt. They didn't see that. What became the start of the fight is the moment that the father reacted and punched the man for saying that to him, for having the audacity of saying that to him. Well, the United Nations, if the United Nations pretends to solve or keep us from warring in this world, it should understand the world, it should understand the relationship between nations in a human capacity as such, and should be just as vehemently strong and decisive in towards those events that don't seem to stir too much reaction, but which build up the initial offense, which later causes countries to do something that catches everybody's attention because it is more defined as violence. We can take this analogy to smaller scales, and we'll find that in many conflicts there was already violence occurring, but we excused it, we let it go, we have become jaded and desensitized, and we think that there's a certain amount of shoving and pushing and hitting that does not constitute war. And then all of a sudden, when people are able to use a narrative, they take it, they self-absolve, they present the description of the event as if they had nothing to do with it, like the man who offended the father by first telling him that he treats his son like dirt, and manages to convince everybody that he's the victim and the father is a bad, violent person. And it's completely unfair. The United Nations really is not serving humanity to keep us from warring, because it's being instrumental towards the systems and administrations and those that are able to use those established rules, unemotional, administrative, systemizing rules to their advantage insofar as being able to shout loud, knowing that they will be able to make a stronger impact, catch, call forth more attention from the world, because the world pays attention to a narrative that seems more physically determining, and the United Nations and other treaties and systems and administrations of running the world that we have invented and created function in a sense as elements that would constitute those more obvious physical assaults. So if for example, let's take the Bolivian Chilean conflict of Atacama, right? Bolivia had the part that is today Atacama, and I forget what Iquitos and other, no, that's Peru, but anyways, northern Chile used to be Bolivia. I mean, Chile was not there at all. I mean, if you look at a map of the 1800s, Bolivia came to the ocean, and Chile stopped right about the same height, a little bit below Argentina, more or less. And Peru had a little leg that came down, and below that came Bolivia, and below that was Chile. Well, the Chileans were doing better, and they started running the salt mines, I believe there were, and then, commercial and industrial agreements were breached, and the Chileans started feeling like they had more right to that, and they saw that they could beat the Bolivians possibly, and they took that territory. Instead of saying, hey, you owe us money for, you can't just appropriate those businesses, we'll leave, but, you have a huge debt with us. They took it to sovereignty because they saw they could take the territory from Bolivia. And so they literally stole that territory from Bolivia. Well, when this made it finally to the United Nations recently, the United Nations looked at these rules, these laws that we established to help us run our world, and said, well, basically, Bolivia, you agreed to having lost that, so it's no longer yours. But Bolivia really never stopped denouncing that. Just like the Argentinians never stopped denouncing that they were already, starting to settle the Falklands, which were called the Malvinas, when the English showed no interest to actually staying on the islands. They wanted to own them from afar. The Spanish vacated and pretty much left them to the Argentinians. And then the English saw, well, we have a country here that really can't do anything about it. We'll just go back and reclaim them and say we were there before you guys. And they took the islands from the Argentinians. So history can be told through the emotional human values which actually cause events, actually cause the reactions that do make history as it is told. And it can be told by ways that conveniently seem to make it clearer or louder, one being right over the other. So, are we being fair? Are we being just? Is the ultimate question. And it would be the ultimate question that the United Nations should ask itself if it truly intends to keep wars from happening in the world of humanity. It needs to understand the human mind. It needs to understand why things really happened, why they reacted, why things started happening. If it is going to solve them and do justice, do and prescribe a justice that is acceptable by human beings. Because the solution cannot relate to inert systems while the actions and the actions that cause the conflicts relate to human emotional reaction. You can't say, well, although this started because of greed, because of bullying, taking advantage of, or sneakily trying to advance slowly and gradually with a long-term goal of establishing us, our culture and eventually our military presence in that country more strongly in the future. These are all emotional human approaches to a situation. The United Nations can't say, oh, it all started when Russia did this. No, no, no. It did not start then. That was not the main problem, even though it is the loudest, it is the most egregious, eye-catching, attention demanding event that, oh my God, the Russians are moving their army into. No, they are trying a solution that necessarily prescribes the use of force, given a situation that is complex, that has been developing for a while since before 2014. But the United Nations doesn't look at all that. It knows about it, and people in the United Nations know about it and know why Russia actually had to do this, felt it had to do, or had no other recourse but to act in this way now. But when it actually goes into action, it doesn't solve the world through our humanity. It solves it through these systems. And the people that best know how to use these systems, these inert rules, are the ones who are able to instrumentalize the United Nations better than those that hope the United Nations will bring justice to the world. So basically, well, I'm not going to start talking about the United Nations because it completely needs to be reconfigured. It needs to be equally representative demographically in terms of power, in terms of interest. It needs to be much more organic. It can't be about managing war according to the more powerful nations that have more influence in the world. It has to manage the world according to its whole population, according to people. And the geographical organic aspects of resources and our future, and what's the point of wars that have to do with oil? It has to be thinking about how long that oil is going to last and how we're going to fix problems that also have to do with our natural resources, not just what belongs to who today, but it has to have a historical. The United Nations should, if it's going to be an instrument to help humanity, it has to be an instrument that goes back and understands, well, you cannot expect these people to not continue holding an offensive grudge when for 50 years you have been ruling their economy, influencing their politicians, stripping them from the self-pride of the sense of owning their own destiny. The United Nations has to address these things as strongly as it does events that have to do with, when the trigger was finally pulled. Otherwise, it's basically going to get abused by those who have more fingers on triggers and have more bills in their wallets and have more influence and control the language. That's another great injustice of the United Nations, is that protocol and reasoning of systems are carried through in the English language. And so people that are of mother tongue English come comfortably. We don't look at this human aspect. It's very much true. Countries that depend on their few diplomats and politicians who can speak better English, present their people at the General Assembly, and I mean, there are tattletale signs, for example, the fact that when they all read their statements, they are Xerox copies of one another. And so what does that tell you? Well, somebody had to be back there saying, this is what we're all going to say. Because without knowing that that happened. You know it happened because everybody says the same thing. Nonetheless, we're still going to put our 2 cents, even though we condemn what Russia did. They all say exactly the same. That means that somebody had to write the original, the original letter, the original statement. Somewhere there had to be an original version, right? And who wrote that? It wasn't the Chinese, even though they ended up saying something just like everybody else. More than likely, they were people who, you know, whose whose mother tongue is that language that is being used ultimately. And so there's a lot of contradiction in the United Nations. The United Nations is all about the equality of all nations. And that means the equality of all languages and all peoples and all countries' destinies. And that means the emotional fairness throughout history for each country. You can't take a circumstance that happens at a point in time and then all of a sudden use all these systems to try to create a self-absolving narrative that through a heroic victimization uh, gets everybody to be on one side and everybody to call the other one the bad one. That means that the United Nations is completely useless. It doesn't really serve the world of humanity. So that's just what I wanted to say. Thanks. I hope it made sense to people who watch this. So long. Good night.